Okay. So as Ava said, we're here to discuss different policy options for your coastal states. And the impetus behind this is really to blanket it with the America the Beautiful initiative that the White House has put forward and is collaborating with, as you all know, several federal agencies to have this come to fruition. I'm not going to go through the report that they published with the Department of Interior, but these are the principles they put together to ensure that coastal states and communities are being thorough as they go to protect 30% of our lands and water, ensure that it's done in an equitable way. However, I have to say, before we get to what these laws and policies could be, I think it's very important for us to keep in mind that climate change is going to hang over all of these decisions. In fact, we know that our oceans and coast are literally at the center of climate change. Our ocean has absorbed 90% of the heat that's been trapped in our atmosphere and about 30% of the carbon. Clearly, it's causing widespread severe impacts. Surfrider created this graphic here so we could kind of show our constituents the kind of terrestrial side and the marine side of what implications of climate change would have on our coastal communities. So having said that, let's get into ways that your state and local communities can go about protecting 30 by 30. And while some of this might be pretty obvious to you, I pulled this law from California because it's so substantive and it had been in the works for so long. And it really is looked to from around the world as a great way to establish marine protected area legislation. And I'm sure most of you are aware of what MPAs are. They're underwater refuge where extraction is limited. There's different types of uses you can have. You can see on the right side here for California, we have like no take. We have places where you can just recreate. There's different types of MPAs that you can have. And of course, when we started working on this, I actually worked on this from the beginning, totally aging myself here, but we originally just were like, yay, healthy ecosystems. And then, fast forward to the past 5 years and it's like, oh, great, not only healthy ecosystems, but these MPAs lessen climate change impacts. So as you can see here, it was, written and adopted in 1999. It actually had one attempt and we started a few MPAs and then it kind of languished for a year. And then it came back in a full robust fashion where the state set up a system, which we'll get to in a second here, because without that system, it makes it challenging to ensure that everyone is involved in making MPAs. For everyone who uses them in general. So we went through this process. We have 124 MPAs from the Mexican border to Oregon. We are covering about 16% of our waters as protected compared to the 3% before we did the redesign. Now, here's how that it was set up. As I said, I'm not going to go through this at length, but it goes to show you that both regional, local groups were the first to kind of come up with where they want these marine protected areas. And I'm not going to lie, it was contentious. Of course, fishermen wanted something, other people wanted something, recreationists wanted something. And so it was really important to start with the regional stakeholder groups so that it came from the local community and bubbled up. And then the two entities in the middle were kind of the objective science policy measures. And then as these proposals came through, then the Fish and Game Commission would look at all the alternatives for each different parts of the coast and finally adopt that. So if your state is interested in doing this, it's called the Marine Life Protection Act. The legislation is up on the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and it is, again, very substantive and almost a kind of a play-by-play on how to establish marine protected areas. So another way that your communities and states, which I'm sure, again, you know of, is to utilize the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It's been dubbed as America's best conservation program. It was established by President Kennedy. It's a very simple concept. It is to take revenues from offshore oil and gas revenues and to protect a plethora of sensitive habitats and improve recreational opportunities. Obviously, you can see all the statistics here. It's pretty impressive what has gone on so far. I mean, over $18 billion, 40,000 projects, 7 million acres federal lands, 2.5 million kind of state local lands. And the reason why I have this, and I'm sure, again, you're all aware of this, but just a couple of years ago, it was fully and permanently funded. And it wasn't that way for 50 years. It would go through the appropriations process of Congress, and, it was kind of a battle. And so we finally passed legislation to have it permanently funded, which means that there's more monies available for your state. And I think this is the crux of how we're all going to be able to protect 30 by 30 by 2030, is to utilize programs like this. We're going to go quickly through just a few examples. I wanted to know who was present today, so in what state and legislators. And so I pulled out just a few very, very quick examples. As you see on the right here, we actually published a report kind of breaking down the millions and billions of dollars that have come from these land and water conservation projects at your state level. So here we have in Washington, LWF land is now helping buffer sea level rise in Friday Harbor, which will be pretty subjected to sea level rise in terms of what Washington has projected for future sea level rise levels. In Connecticut, the Land and Water Conservation Restoration project that's going on in the marsh there is going to elevate the marsh itself. And so again, we'll be able to protect land and water and communities from climate change impacts. In Hawaii, there is the Land and Water Conservation Park that helped absorb massive flooding. 2 years ago, this area was inundated with rain. It had 50 inches of rain. I'd never seen it before, and it had over $20 billion in damage. And I feel like, if this, if this land and water conservation project hadn't been there, the damage would have definitely been worse, because it's obviously protected as open space instead of development. And so that kind of helped buffer not only the storm, but also the economic impacts. In Rhode Island, just the last few examples here, the LWF fund is helping stabilize a beach. And in fact, in the past 40 years, the southern part of this beach has eroded 40 feet, which is tremendous from a geologic standpoint. And so again, getting these funds and protecting this area and doing restoration and stabilizing the area, again, is that 20 or that 30 by 30 approach, but also has the climate adaptation benefits as well. This one's my favorite in Georgia. The funds from the LWCF are helping preserve one of the last remaining forest marshes. That's a pretty unique ecosystem that most states do not have. And then finally, in North Carolina, established one of the most important and popular parks in North Carolina. This park alone brings in $1 billion to the local economy. And I show that because it's like your state can get a nominal amount of money. I don't know how much this was, 1.8 million that was given to protect and establish this park. And in the decades thereafter, it has produced about $1 billion, which means it can be reinvested into other ways to do coastal resilience and protect 30 by 30. So as we get closer, I wanted to just show you what Surfrider had. It's 20 seconds. So these are the spots in California. So that's kind of like getting at the federal level, getting at larger policies that protect both land and water. But what does it really boil down to? Your states. You guys are in the throes of protecting these important places and also having to deal with more extreme weather events and climate change impacts. And so we put together, again, a very, very short video on how we're trying to raise awareness with communities and states that aren't really aware of how we need to be protecting our coastal recreation and ecological resources. Sorry about that. So from here on out, I hope that you can ride the wave with us to, again, bring these concepts from existing federal funds and programs and filter them to your states so that you can implement coastal conservation, restoration, and climate adaptation policies. And as you're using existing funds and programs, it's also important to advocate for new funding and federal legislation, which is also occurring right now in Washington, D.C. This is the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act. It is an enormous, lovely, wonderful bill. I swear to God, it's like my favorite book right now. But we've pulled out just 4 pieces of this legislation that will specifically apply to your states and how you can, again, go about doing the 30 by 30 or just, again, planning for coastal resilience and sea level rise. A lot of the states on the East Coast and the Gulf have been trying to ban offshore oil drilling, and this bill would do that. And a lot of states on the East Coast are also dealing with wind energy. And so this would make sure that any of that development is done responsibly. Blue carbon is another really important thing for our coastal states. We'll talk a little bit more in detail on what that looks like, but this legislation would give states $600 million a year to be able to do these restoration projects within blue carbon areas. For me, the most exciting part of this legislation is the $10 billion that would go to coastal restoration. It would also help communities relocate, which is a concept called managed retreat. In the past, it's been an intimidating concept, but unfortunately, we're starting to see that there's many communities that are having to move right now because of sea level rise and climate change. I mean, it's all over. There's places in America from Alaska to Louisiana to Virginia. As you saw yesterday, the capital of Jakarta is moving, which will take 500,000 people out of harm's way and have to relocate them. And so this legislation would say, if there's a community that's in peril, we need to help them. And how does that look? And that would become through helping relocation and fund coastal restoration. And then finally, these emerging issues. And I'm so glad we have people from Florida and Washington here, because as you know, your states are really getting the brunt of these harmful algae blooms and ocean acidification. So I have about 10 pieces of legislation that I would like to propose to all coastal states. And this is not it. These are just things that your state and local community should be doing or having on their radar anyway, so that you can protect coastal resources and marine habitat. I can't tell you how much, it's a whole nother webinar about approving better development standards. There's so much new development that's going on in harm's way. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Again, your community should be thinking about retrofitting, elevating infrastructure if it's in harm's way, managed retreat, buyout programs, what I just talked about. Every coastal state should be doing some type of watershed restoration. Watersheds are what make our beaches. And if they're dammed or have too much upland development, we're starving our beaches of sand that will come there. So trying to get those watersheds to release sand is imperative. Of course, dune restoration helps with withstanding sea level rise, using nature-based solutions, or on the East Coast, it's usually called living shorelines, instead of coastal armoring, which again can exacerbate erosion. And then finally, in terms of the equity standpoint, as there's no 2 ways about it. Sea level rise is going to take our beaches and our communities. And if we don't be proactive about it, we're going to have less recreation and less safe communities. And so these are some legal ways to go about doing that, is establishing conservation easements and doing land acquisition. Again, you can use funds from the LWCF. There's other funds maybe from your state where you can try to do land acquisition. And then rolling easements is kind of a flashy word for, hey, as our beaches shrink, these easements will have to roll closer to inland so that there are places for folks to recreate and for ecological resources to have a habitat there. And last, these are also some things that are just really easy to do for states. And that is establishing blue carbon programs. Essentially, blue carbon is just what it says here. It's seagrass, kelp, marshes, and it helps absorb carbon. In fact, these blue carbon ecosystems absorb 4 times the amount of carbon than forests on land. And that's just mind-blowing to me. And this is like newish science, in the past couple decades that we're starting to realize this. A lot of you know your local communities are pushing sand around on beaches, doing sand replenishment to ensure that there's enough places for people to recreate. But there's also times where dredging is happening and some of that sand is just being dumped offshore. And so we need to find better ways to reuse our sand, the healthy sand in good ways. And again, these just go back to building standards, right? Like ensuring that we have green roofs. There's vegetation on the roofs. It traps anywhere between 40 to 80% of the rain, which again, lessens the rain going into your coastal communities and causing erosion. Green parking lots, green streets, they have porous concrete, it's kind of same concept. And bioswales, which I feel like we should have all of our coastal states on side of highways and parking lots have these, they're essentially slopes and channels that help filter heavy rains and again, decrease erosion and flooding. So how are y'all doing? We publish a report every year where we grade coastal states on 4 specific categories. And I'll show you those in a little bit, and we'll dive into it so you can get a really substantive idea of what we're looking at and really what coastal states should be doing to protect both coastal resources and prepare for climate change. So as you can see, not so bad, but not so good. The previous year, we had about 75% of coastal states, Great Lakes and Gulf states are not prepared for sea level rise or doing a good job of planning. This year actually went down to about 64% because a lot of states improved some of their legislation and their coastal planning through the Coastal Zone Management Act, which again is a federal program that you can get monies from to run your coastal programs. And I don't know if there's anyone from Georgia here, I hope so, but shout out to y'all because you had the biggest increase in grades. You went from an F to a C-. And the reason why that happened is because you really put so much effort into ensuring proper sea level rise planning. You passed legislation, you updated your Coastal Zone Management Act program. You really went out of the way to ensure that sea level rise planning and protecting natural areas that can buffer sea level rise are being protected. So that's great. So let's just give a quick, I'm not expecting anyone to read this just right off the bat, but this is kind of what the report card looks like. And I chose Oregon for a couple reasons, but here they are. You know, we grade them. We have the overall state situation, good laws and policies they have on the books. We have 16 different categories. We put, numbers into so it's not arbitrary. Like we're getting a vibe, you get a B. No, it's like we actually have concrete numbers and a way to evaluate this. And then as you can see at the bottom, we have these recommendations that are very specific to state policies and legislation. And in Oregon, they passed Goal 18, which really is to preserve and protect coastal resources and guide land development. And so we have some recommendations on how they can improve Goal 18 to make it stronger. They're doing very well for all intents and purposes. But again, this is what your state really should be wrapping their head around. And I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with everyone. But when we look at, and obviously we grade more than what's in these little snippets here, but this is like the cliff note, how does your state manage sediment and deal with resources to ensure that the habitats are healthy and beaches are there for recreation and tourism? How does the state deal with coastal armoring? Does it ensure it's not the first line of defense and that other alternatives, nature-based solutions are being used for erosion control? And is the state doing long-term thinking for erosion or just Band-Aid fixes with coastal armoring? Development, to me, this is the most important. Most states, I hate to say it, are very poor with these standards and continually build new development in harm's way. It's not just Surfrider who thinks this. Zillow did a report a couple years ago and went through states that have been building in flood-prone areas in the past 10 years, and it's absolutely gobsmacking. I would go just do a Google search because I'm sure your state is in there with an analysis. And then finally, how is the state planning for sea level rise? Are they doing vulnerability assessments? Are they doing adaptation planning, implementation plans? And most importantly, are they working with local communities to do this planning? So here we are towards the end. This is the I guess why we're here, the grand finale, is to go over potential legislation options. Some of your states might have these in place already. Some of these ideas might be a little bit bold for some of your states, but I do think if we're trying to protect 30% of our waters and land by 2030, and if we're trying to get ahead of climate change impacts and sea level rise, we really should be looking at these pieces of legislation in the future. So obviously, just stop building in harm's way and where areas have sea level rise. It is just full stop. In fact, we're working on the federal level to ensure that even like FEMA and federal agencies are pushing this, because obviously we'll have less impacts if we stop building in these areas. Right now in Washington state, actually, there's a bill 1099 that is updating the general plan of the Washington state, and they're trying to put sea level rise analysis in there. California already has this as well. There's a few states that require that local plans have sea level rise planning and analysis. This one to me, which I'll talk about way more in detail on the next slide. There's 2 case studies I pulled out, and then we can go to discussion. But requiring sea level rise disclosures in a real estate transaction, I just feel like it's an inalienable right for us to live in homes that aren't going to be in danger. Plus, we'll get to some other reasons in a second. Requiring setbacks. So this goes, yes, you can ban new development in flood-prone areas, but you need to have a way to ensure that it's going to be fail-safe. And the way to do that is to set up setbacks. And a lot of states and Georgia had a great setback update. Before, they used to do setbacks based on tree lines. And it just is kind of charming in that way, because it's the old school nature of the coastal areas there. And then recently they updated it to have a more substantive demarcation of where setbacks go. But these are what Surfrider believes, and a lot of coastal advocates, is that there needs to be rates of erosion, both past and future. You need to analyze a 100-year flood. And then of course you need to overlay sea level rise vulnerability studies to show where sea level rise will go. So then you can then calculate the setbacks. The blue carbon we've already talked about, just establishing a fund so you can do restoration and protection. This one's a little bit bold, and every state has something different. Hawaii has this in place already. As I mentioned, when seawalls, revetments, jetties, groins, any of these hard structures that are within our coastal zone essentially trap sediment. And so it does end up stealing sand from our beaches. And so if we can take out some of these seawalls in places where it might be viable, and of course it won't be viable in some places, I have no delusions of grandeur, but there are places, I know even here in California, where we could remove a couple structures like this to allow more sand. And in fact, in Hawaii, like I said, they just passed a law 2 years ago that will require removal of illegal structures. And I think that's pretty progressive. This one, the improving building inspection regulations and laws is very sensitive. I think this is critical for every state to go back to their legislature and look at what's already on the books. You'd be surprised. I've done just preliminary research. There's very few solid inspections that are on the books for any state. And I feel like if we had had this in Florida, we could avoid some of the catastrophes we might be seeing there, just to ensure that if a building is already being inundated with seawater or is in a harmful area, that it's regularly inspected to ensure its safety. Of course, we talked about managed retreat. Let's pretend you have a piece of legislation that bases managed retreat on triggers. And that's just really easy trigger-based planning, right? Let's say you have a hospital that's on the coastline. We actually have one in Laguna Beach down here. And just say, okay, we're going to set the baseline at it's 400 feet from the shoreline. And then when it gets to be 20 feet from the shoreline, we have to start identifying ways to move this hospital, which will be inundated with seawater and electricity problems, et cetera. So it's really and it's very local specific, but to have a trigger-based planning mechanism in place. And then establishing a revolving fund for managed retreat. And I'm going to get into that right now. So California last year had a piece of legislation that went to the governor's desk. It passed both houses. A year before, it was controversial. Last year it sailed through, got to the governor's desk, and he said, I'm not going to sign this. It's not robust enough. So it goes to show you how the climate crisis and sea level rise and the need to protect 30 by 30 is pushing us to kind of have these really expansive, progressive, creative ways to deal with this. So essentially what this legislation did is it says it right there in the news subject, municipalities will rent out the home until they're uninhabitable, and then buy the home back. The homeowner would be made whole or get some money somehow, and then the state would have to deal with moving the structure that's in harm's way. And I agree with the governor. I think it needed it to be more robust. I think that there need to be elements of proximity taxation. That's just a fancy way of saying homes that are closest to the beach being to pay some nominal tax to some type of fund to get this revolving fund up and running. Again, this whole webinar has been about cooperating and using federal funds to filter to your local communities, maybe setting up a program with FEMA, creating state bonds, as all your states do anyway, for different measures. And then there's a few municipalities that have sued oil companies. In fact, just down the road from me in Imperial Beach, they've sued Shell for the impending and current problems they're receiving from climate change impacts and sea level rise, and to use some of those funds to make this revolving fund robust so that it's equitable. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to just be buying rich people's homes. And I know that sounds very flippant, and I'm sorry if that does, but I do believe it has to be equitable and that everybody has to pay into this somehow. And last slide is the real estate disclosures in Hawaii. This one, our chapters worked on really heavily. We testified. Obviously, it goes to what I was saying earlier. We all have an inalienable right to safety and to know that we will be safe under the roof of our homes. But secondly, you don't want to be an unassuming buyer and buy a home when it's already been saturated with sea level rise and you do not know that. So Hawaii is the only state in the nation that has a sea level rise disclosure. Yes, some states and most states do have some nominal or not nominal, tiny amount of flooding mechanisms or flood prone areas or rivers, but there's no law that describes in detail sea level rise. So just to shake it down very top level, and I can share the language with everyone on the bill that went through, is essentially the state of Hawaii has already done vulnerability assessments. So they know exactly where sea level rise is going to be. So a state has to do that, do vulnerability assessments, find out future sea level rise projections. You have a layover of a map and you look at homes that are in that area and then you tell the homeowner, hey, guess what? You're in this area. We mapped it. You need to disclose that you're in a future sea level rise area if you sell your home. So it's really straightforward. And again, it goes to the equity of not just people, but our beaches, because as you can see here, this is the North Shore in Oahu. And you can kind of see those are actually, they're called burrito bags. They're just big geotextile bags that are cloth that are stuffed with sand. And they're plastic. And you can see the blackness has been exposed to water. And so all of that is it's just environmentally damaging for so many reasons. And so again, it's not just the human angle, it's the ecological angle to ensure we find out where sea level rise is and to ensure the safety of our communities and our ecosystems. So that's it. I'm just so happy to kind of connect what we can do. Here's our team. We have a lobby day in DC. We bring about 160 people. We had over 100 meetings last year with congressional representatives and the Biden administration. And yeah, so we're out here to help you. And again, I'm so thankful that most of you in your coastal states have really taken up the torch to ensure we are going to be able to protect 30 by 30. So I'm happy to take some